My name is Claire Hendricks. I am 38 years old. I work as a licensed home appraiser in Dayton, Ohio. I have spent the last 12 years walking through other people's houses, measuring rooms, calculating value, writing reports that determine what a property is worth and who has the right to claim it. None of that prepared me for what my sister did while I was standing at our mother's grave. My mother died on a Thursday in March. She was 67 years old. Her name was Patricia Ann Hendricks, and she had lived in the same house on Birchwood Lane in Fairview, Ohio for 31 years. She raised 2 daughters in that house. She planted a rose garden along the back fence every spring. She kept a ceramic cookie jar, shaped like a barn owl, on the kitchen counter that she filled with shortbread every single Sunday. The house smelled like cedar and warm bread, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where someone has lived alone for a long time, and filled the silence with small, careful routines. My sister's name is Dana. She is 42. She is 4 years older than me, and she has always operated under the assumption that being oldest meant being first. First to receive, first to decide, first to inherit. We were not close growing up. Dana was the kind of child who understood how to position herself in a room, how to stand near the light, how to speak when adults were listening, how to make herself necessary. I was the kind of child who stayed in the kitchen and helped with dishes. Our mother saw both of us clearly. I think she loved Dana, the way you love someone who keeps you slightly off balance, with effort, with intention, with one eye always open. She loved me the way you love someone you trust completely, quietly, without performance. Mom never said that out loud, but she showed it in the way she called me on Tuesday evenings, just to talk about nothing, in the way she asked me to keep a copy of her important documents, her insurance papers, her bank account numbers, her deed. She said, "Someday you will need these, and I want them somewhere safe." I kept them in a fireproof box under my bed for 6 years. I did not think about that box on the morning she died. I was at her house when it happened. I had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the living room for the past 11 days, rotating shifts with the hospice nurse, making sure she was never alone. Dana had visited once in that stretch. She stayed for 3 hours on a Sunday, rearranged the items on the kitchen counter for reasons she did not explain, and left before dinner. Mom passed at 4:47 in the morning. The room was very still. The hospice nurse was there. I was holding her hand. There was nothing dramatic about it. No final words, no long goodbye. She simply stopped breathing, and the room became a different kind of quiet than it had been before. I called Dana at 5 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been awake. She said, "I will handle the arrangements." I said, "I already called the funeral home." She said, "I will be there by noon." She arrived at 2:15. The funeral was held the following Tuesday. It was a grey morning, the kind of grey that feels permanent, like the sky has decided not to try. There were 41 people in the church. Dana stood at the front and accepted condolences with the practiced composure of someone who had planned for this moment. I stood beside her and shook hands and said thank you and tried to remember people's names. Afterward, at the cemetery, I stood at the edge of the grave and watched them lower the casket, and I thought about the barn owl cookie jar and the shortbread and the Tuesday phone calls, and I did not think about the house on Birchwood Lane at all. That was my first mistake, not thinking about the house. The reception was at my mother's neighbor Carol's place 2 doors down. People brought casseroles and store-bought cookies and told stories about Mom that I'd never heard before, small kindnesses she had shown that she never mentioned to anyone. I stayed until 6 in the evening. Dana left at 4. She said she had a headache. She said she needed to lie down. I drove back to Mom's house at 8 that night to feed her cat, a grey tabby named Franklin, who had lived on the back porch for 7 years and regarded everyone with mild suspicion. I let myself in with my key. The kitchen light was on. I had not left it on. The ceramic cookie jar was in the center of the counter, exactly where it always was. The shortbread was gone. Dana must have taken it, I thought. I did not think more about it than that. I fed Franklin. I checked the rooms. I turned off the kitchen light. I locked the front door. I drove home. I did not know that while I was standing at my mother's grave that morning, Dana had been 40 minutes away at the Fairview County Recorder's office. I found out 4 days later. I was at my own kitchen table on a Saturday morning, still in the sweatshirt I had slept in, drinking coffee that had gone cold. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a woman named Pamela Greer. Pamela was a real estate agent who had sold 3 houses on Birchwood Lane in the past 2 years. I knew her professionally. Her message said, "Claire, I wanted to reach out directly before you heard it from someone else. I am representing the listing at 412 Birchwood Lane. I want you to know I did not realize the full situation when I accepted it. I am so sorry for your loss." I read the text twice. Then I set down my coffee cup, picked up my phone, and typed back one sentence. "What listing?" She called me immediately. Her voice was careful, the way voices get when someone knows they are delivering information that will change a day permanently. "Claire, the property at 412 Birchwood Lane was listed for sale yesterday. It came through my office Friday afternoon. The seller of record is Dana Louise Hendricks. I have the paperwork in front of me. The deed transfer was recorded at the county on Thursday, the day of the funeral. I know, I am so sorry." I sat very still at my kitchen table. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn. I could hear the engine through the window. I sat, and I listened to it. And I thought about the deed my mother had given me to keep, the deed that was in the fireproof box under my bed. I said to Pamela, "I need to call you back." I went to the bedroom. I pulled the fireproof box from under the bed. I unlocked it. The insurance papers were there. The bank account information was there. The deed was not. I pulled out every document, laid them flat on the bed, went through them twice. The deed was gone. It had been in this box for 6 years. It was not here now. I sat on the edge of the bed with the empty box in my hands. And I understood exactly when it had gone missing. Dana had been in this house the previous Sunday. She had rearranged the kitchen counter for no reason. She had left before dinner, and I had been at the hospital with Mom, and I had left Dana alone in this house for 4 hours. I picked up my phone. I called my mother's attorney. His name was Gerald Marsh. He was 61, a quiet man who wore the same dark green tie to every appointment and kept a plastic dish of wrapped butterscotch candies on his desk that he had never once offered to me in 11 years. I left a voicemail. I said it was urgent. I said it was about the estate. He called back in 20 minutes. 20? "Gerald, my mother died on Thursday." I said, "Yes, he knew. The funeral was Tuesday. Yes. My sister Dana filed a deed transfer at the county recorder on Thursday, the same day as the funeral." Gerald was quiet. I said, "I need to know how that is possible. And I need to know what I do now." He asked me one question. "Does your mother's will specify the disposition of the property?" I said, "I did not know the contents of the will." He said, "Come in Monday morning." I said I would be there at 8. I did not sleep Saturday night. I lay in bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I went over it the way I go over an appraisal report, line by line, detail by detail, looking for the number that does not match. Dinah had known about the deed. She must have known it was in my house, which meant she had either searched for it deliberately that Sunday, or she had heard Mom mention it. At some point, she had filed a transfer on the day of the funeral, which meant she had prepared the paperwork in advance. You do not file a deed transfer the day of a funeral by accident. You prepare it. You have it notarized. You drive to the county office before it closes. She would have had to leave the cemetery directly after the burial. She left early. She said she had a headache. I thought about that headache. I thought about what it costs to plan something like that and still stand at your mother's grave and accept condolences for 2 hours first. I thought about what it says about a person. Sunday morning, I drove to Birchwood Lane. I sat in my car in front of the house and looked at it. The rose garden along the back fence was not visible from the street, but I knew it was there. The barn owl cookie jar was inside on the counter. Franklin was on the back porch. The house was listed for sale. My mother had been dead for 10 days. I called Dana from the car. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was even, careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed the conversation. Claire. Hi. I need you to explain the deed transfer, I said. The house on Birchwood Lane. It was filed Thursday. Under your name. Dana paused. 1 beat, 2. I talked to an attorney, she said. Mum's estate was complicated. I was protecting the asset. From what? I said. From probate delays. From creditors. I wanted to make sure the property was secured while the estate is being settled. Dana, I said, you transferred the deed the day of the funeral. She said, the timing was not ideal, but it was necessary. I said, you listed the house for sale with Pamela Greer. Another pause. I am exploring options. I said, take it off the market. She said, Claire, you need to understand the full financial picture before you react. I said, I am not reacting. I am telling you to take it off the market. She said she would think about it. I ended the call. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at the table and I did not drink it. I picked up my phone and I called my mother's neighbor, Carol, the one who had hosted the reception. Carol had known my mother for 22 years. She knew everything that happened on Birchwood Lane. I asked her one question. Carol, in the last 6 months, did Dana visit Mom often? Carol was quiet for a moment. She said, Dana came by about once a month. Usually on weekdays, when you were at work. She would stay for an hour or 2. Your mom never said what they talked about. But once, Carol said, I saw Dana leaving with a folder. A manila folder. Kind of thick. Your mom was standing at the door, watching her go. She had a look on her face I could not quite read. I thanked Carol. I sat with that image. A manila folder, kind of thick. My mother, at the door, watching. A look on her face Carol could not quite read. Mum had known. She had known what Dana was doing, and she had not told me. Not because she did not trust me, but because she had already prepared. She had already given me the deed to keep safe. She had already seen Gerald Marsh about the will, and she had given me the document she knew I would need. She just did not know Dana would find a way around it first. Monday morning, 8 o'clock. I was in Gerald Marsh's office with my fireproof box and 6 years of documents and 1 missing deed. Gerald read the will in full. It was 8 pages and it was very clear. The property at 412 Birchwood Lane was left to Claire Ann Hendricks, not to both daughters, not to the estate to be divided, to me, alone, by name. There was a note at the end of the bequest. In language Gerald said your mother had specifically requested. She had written, Claire has been the caretaker of this house and of my wishes. It belongs with her. Gerald took off his reading glasses and set them on his desk, beside the butterscotch candy dish. He folded his hands and looked at me. The deed transfer your sister filed is fraudulent, he said. Your mother's signature on that transfer was either forged or obtained, under circumstances that did not reflect her true intent. Given that she named you as the sole beneficiary of the property less than 8 months ago, the transfer has no legal standing. We can challenge it. I said, what do we need? He said, the original deed. I opened my fireproof box and laid everything flat on his desk. I said, she took it. He nodded like this was not the first time someone had said this to him. He said, "That is all right. The county recorder has the original on file, and your mother's will supersedes the transfer." I said, "How long will this take?" He said, "That depends on whether Dana cooperates or fights." I said, "She will fight." He said, "I know. Are you ready for that?" I said, "Yes." He offered me a butterscotch candy for the first time in 11 years. I took it. Gerald filed the challenge to the deed transfer that same Monday afternoon. He sent a formal letter to Dana through certified mail. He also sent a copy to Pamela Greer, informing her that the property at 412 Birchwood Lane was subject to a probate dispute and that the listing had no legal standing until the matter was resolved. Pamela pulled the listing within 2 hours. She sent me a text that said, "Done. I am sorry I did not ask more questions at the start." I told her she could not have known. That was true. Dana had presented her with paperwork that looked clean. A signed deed, a notarized transfer, a seller of record. Pamela had done her job. Dana had done hers better. Tuesday morning, Dana called. I did not answer. She called again at noon. I did not answer. At 2 in the afternoon, she sent a text. "Claire, we need to talk about this, like adults before it gets out of hand." I showed the text to Gerald. He said, "Do not respond. Let me handle the communication from here." I said, "She will escalate." He said, "I know. Let her." That is often how the truth comes out. I went back to work on Wednesday. I had 3 appraisals scheduled, and I could not afford to push them. I walked through other people's houses, measuring rooms and taking photographs and writing down square footage. And I thought about Birchwood Lane the entire time. I thought about the rose garden. I thought about Franklin on the back porch. I thought about the barn owl cookie jar sitting on the counter of a house that was no longer listed, but still in dispute. I thought about my mother standing at the front door watching Dana walk away with a manila folder. A look on her face Carol could not quite read. I understood that look now. It was the look of a woman who had already made her decision and was watching someone try to undo it. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was patience. The particular patience of someone who knows the ending and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Thursday afternoon, Gerald called. Dana had retained an attorney. His name was Marcus Tiley. Gerald knew him. He said, "He is not a specialist in estate law, but he is aggressive. He will file a motion to contest the will on grounds of undue influence. He will argue that you had disproportionate access to your mother in her final months and use that access to influence the bequest." I said, "That is exactly backwards." He said, "I know. That is why it will not hold, but it will slow things down and cost you money." I said, "How much money?" He gave me a number. I sat with it. I said, "Do we have a strong case?" He said, "We have the stronger case." "There is a difference." I said, "What do I need to do?" He said, "Write down everything. Every visit to your mother in the last 2 years. Every phone call, every errand, every medical appointment you drove her to, every document she asked you to keep. Write it down with dates and times, and I will turn it into a record." I spent that evening at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, writing down every Tuesday phone call I could remember. I filled 14 pages. Friday morning, I drove to Carol's house. Carol was 71 and had lived on Birchwood Lane longer than anyone. She made tea without asking and set a plate of shortbread on the table between us. I noticed the shortbread and did not say anything about it. I told her what was happening. I told her about the deed transfer and the listing and Gerald's challenge and Dana's attorney. Carol listened, without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother told me something last October." I said, "What did she tell you?" Carol wrapped both hands around her mug. She said Patricia had come over one afternoon and sat in this same kitchen and said, "Carol, if something happens to me, I need you to remember one thing. Dana has been here asking about the house. I want you to know that I know what she is after, and I have already handled it." Carol looked at me. I asked her what she meant by handled it. She said, "I put it where it belongs." Then she went home. 2 weeks later, she was in the hospital for the first time. I put it where it belongs. I wrote that down on my legal pad when I got home. I put it where it belongs. The deed. She had put the deed in my hands 6 years ago. She had seen Gerald 8 months ago. She had written a will that named me by name, with a specific note about why. She had been watching Dana come and go with folders and questions, and she had been quietly, methodically, making sure that none of it would work. My mother had known. She had known for longer than I realized, and she had not panicked. She had prepared. And now I was sitting in her house, with a legal pad and 14 pages of notes, and a fireproof box with one document missing, trying to honor what she had already finished building. I called Gerald that afternoon and told him about Carol. He said she is a witness. I said, will she testify? Carol had already told me yes, before I left her kitchen. Gerald said, good. He said, I also have something for you. The county recorder confirmed that the deed transfer was filed at 4:17 on the afternoon of the funeral. The notarization on the transfer was dated 2 days before the funeral, Tuesday, the day of the service. I did the math out loud. Gerald said, yes. Dana had the transfer notarized the morning of the funeral. She went directly from the service to the county recorder's office. She filed 4 minutes before they closed. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about standing at the grave while the casket was being lowered. I thought about Dana beside me in her dark coat with her hands folded. I thought about her leaving the reception early. A headache, she said. I am going to lie down. She had driven to the county recorder's office and filed a fraudulent deed transfer at 4:17 in the afternoon on the day we buried our mother. I did not say anything to Gerald for a moment. He did not rush me. He said, are you all right? I said, I am. I said, what does this mean legally? He said, it means her timeline is documented. It means we can show exactly when she filed and what she was doing before she filed. In a courtroom, timeline is everything. Motive is invisible. Timeline is not. The following week, Gerald sent me Marcus Tiley's formal response to our challenge. It was 11 pages. The argument was what Gerald had predicted: undue influence. Claire Hendricks had isolated the deceased from her older daughter by acting as primary caregiver. Claire Hendricks had used her professional knowledge as a home appraiser to advise her mother on the value of the property and had done so in a way that benefited herself. Claire Hendricks had been the sole person with access to the decedent's important documents, including the deed, which was now missing from the estate records. I read that last line twice. Dana was using the missing deed against me, the deed she had taken from my house. She was using the absence of the document she had stolen as evidence that I had mishandled the estate. I called Gerald before I finished the letter. He said, I saw it. He said, she is arguing that you lost the deed, not that she took it. I said, can she do that? He said, she can argue anything. Whether it holds is different. He said the county has the original on file. Her transfer used a copy. We can show the chain of custody. We can show that you had possession of the original for 6 years and that it disappeared during the window when Dana was alone in your home. I said, can we prove she took it? He said, not directly, not without a witness. But we can establish the timeline and let a judge draw the reasonable conclusion. 2 days later, I got a call from my cousin Beth. Beth was Dana's age, 42, and had grown up one town over. We were not particularly close, but we were not unfriendly. She said, Claire, I need to tell you something. I said, go ahead. She said, Dana called me last week. She wanted me to write a statement saying that your mother seemed confused in her last year, that she had trouble remembering things and making decisions. She wanted me to say, I had witnessed it personally. I said, "Did you?" Beth was quiet. "Your mum was sharp right up until the end, Claire. She called me on my birthday in January. She remembered the year I graduated high school and asked me if I still kept in touch with my roommate from college. That is not a confused woman." I said, "Will you tell Gerald that?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you, Beth." She said, "Dana asked 3 other cousins the same thing. I do not know if any of them agreed." I said, "I will find out." I spent the next 2 evenings making phone calls. I called 4 cousins. 3 of them had been contacted by Dana. 2 of them had said no. One of them, my cousin Roger, had agreed to write a statement. Roger was 51 and had always deferred to Dana at family gatherings the way some people defer to whoever sounds most certain. I was not angry at Roger. I was sorry for him. He was going to be a witness in a case where the timeline would make his statement worthless, and he did not know it yet. Gerald filed our formal response to Tylee's motion on a Thursday morning. It was 16 pages. It included my 14-page record of visits and phone calls, a certified copy of the will from probate court, a statement from Carol, a statement from Beth, records of the medical appointments I had driven my mother to in her final 2 years, and a copy of the hospice intake paperwork showing me listed as primary contact and caregiver. It also included a 1-page timeline. The timeline showed every date Dana had visited Birchwood Lane in the preceding 18 months, cross-referenced with the dates of her phone calls to my mother and the dates of 3 withdrawals from my mother's bank account that Gerald had flagged during a routine audit of the estate. I had not known about the withdrawals until Gerald showed them to me that Wednesday afternoon, the day before we filed. He set the bank statements on his desk with 3 lines highlighted in yellow: November, January, and February. Amounts of $800, $1,200, and $1,500. Total $3,500 over 4 months. All withdrawn at an ATM branch 15 miles from Birchwood Lane, which was consistent with Dana's address, but not with my mother's usual banking location. My mother had banked at the branch on Harrison Street for 20 years. She had never used the branch on Route 9. Gerald said the amounts were small enough that they would not constitute a felony on their own. But combined with the fraudulent deed transfer and Tylee's motion, they established a pattern of a person who had been accessing and attempting to claim her mother's assets before the estate was legally transferred. Gerald said he was going to include the statements in our filing, but not lead with them. He said, "We do not need to win on every point. We only need to win on the deed. Everything else is context." I said, "Will this go to court?" He said, "Probably not." He said, in his experience, when the other party's attorney sees the full record laid out, they often advise settlement. He said Marcus Tylee was aggressive, but he was not reckless. When he sees the timeline, the will, the witness statements, and the bank records together in one document, he is going to have a conversation with Dana. He is going to tell her that this is not a case she can win at trial, and then she will have a choice to make. I said, "What if she does not settle?" He said, "Then we go to court and we present the same record to a judge." He said the deed transfer was filed 4 days after your mother died, 2 days after it was notarized. On the afternoon of the funeral, the will is certified and clear. Your mother named you by name with a specific note about why. We have a neighbor witness, a cousin witness, medical records, a caregiver record, and a bank audit. He took off his glasses. There is no version of this where Dana wins. The only question is how long she wants to make it take. I drove home from Gerald's office and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The sun was low. The neighbor across the street was watering his front lawn. I thought about my mother in the hospital in January, 3 months before she died, squeezing my hand and telling me where she kept her extra key. I thought about the cedar box she kept on her nightstand with the letters inside. I had not opened that box yet. I was not ready. I thought about the Tuesday phone calls. I thought about the shortbread every Sunday. I thought about the rose garden along the back fence that would need to be tended when spring came. I thought about Dana standing at our mother's grave with her hands folded and her dark coat and her headache, and the county recorder's office closing at 4:30 and 4 minutes to spare. I went inside. I fed my own cat, a small black one named Dot who had no patience for sentiment and wanted dinner immediately. I made myself a sandwich I did not eat. I sat at the kitchen table and I waited for whatever came next. It came 11 days later. Gerald called on a Tuesday morning. He said Tylee contacted me this morning. He said Dana wants to talk. Not through attorneys. She wants to meet with you directly, just the two of you. He said you do not have to. I said, where does she want to meet? He said Birchwood Lane, Mum's house. I was quiet for a moment. I said, when? He said Saturday afternoon. I said yes. I did not tell Gerald why I said yes so quickly. I did not tell him that I had been waiting for this, that everything I had prepared and documented and organized had been leading to a room where it was just the two of us, no attorneys, no paperwork on the table, no carefully rehearsed arguments, just my sister and me in our mother's house, and the truth sitting between us, the way it had been sitting there for months, patient, waiting for the right moment, the way Mum had taught me to wait. Saturday was 4 days away. I used those 4 days carefully. Saturday arrived, the way difficult days always do, quietly, without warning, without the dramatic weather you expect when something important is about to happen. It was a mild April morning, pale sky, no wind, the kind of day that does not take sides. I drove to Birchwood Lane at 1:45. I parked at the curb in front of the house and sat for a moment. The rose garden along the back fence was not visible from the street, but I knew it was starting to bud. Mum had planted it the spring after Dad left. She had dug the rose herself with a hand trowel and her good gardening gloves, and she had told me once that the physical work of it was the point, not the roses, the digging. I understood that better now than I had at the time. Dana's car was already in the driveway. A silver sedan, clean, recently washed. I noticed that. She had washed her car before coming to our mother's house to meet with me about the property she had tried to steal. I noted it the way I note small details in appraisal work, not with judgment, just with attention. Details tell you something about the person. They always do. I took my time locking the car. I walked up the front path. The welcome mat Mum had kept by the door for 20 years was still there, a faded blue one that said home in white letters. I had meant to bring it inside weeks ago to protect it from the weather. I had not gotten around to it. I made a note to do it before I left today. I did not knock. I used my key. Dana was in the living room. She was standing by the window that looked out onto the front yard, her arms crossed, her weight on one foot. She turned when she heard the door. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way people look smaller, when the performance falls away and what is left is just the person underneath. She was wearing a grey sweater, and her hair was pulled back, and there were shadows under her eyes that she had not bothered to cover. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping. Good, I thought. And then I felt sorry for thinking it. I set my bag by the door. I did not sit down. I stood in the center of the room and looked at my sister, across the space that had been our mother's living room for 31 years. The couch was still there, the side table with the reading lamp, the bookshelf with the mystery novels organized by author, the clock on the mantel that Mom had wound every Sunday. Nobody had wound it since she died. It had stopped at 11:42, and I had not been able to make myself start it again. Dana uncrossed her arms. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "You wanted to meet." She nodded. She looked at the floor, then back at me. She said, I want to explain. I said, all right. She said, I need you to understand what the last 2 years have been like for me. I said, I am listening. She told me. She told me in the way people tell things, when they have finally stopped trying to manage how they sound. Her husband had left 18 months ago. Not a separation. A departure. He had packed while she was at work and left a note on the kitchen counter, and she had come home to a half-empty house, and a note, and the particular silence of a space where someone used to be. She had not told anyone. Not me, not Mom, not any of the cousins she had called trying to build a case against Sophie's grandmother. She had told no one because telling someone would have made it real in a way she was not ready for. She had been carrying it alone for 1.5 years, and somewhere in that carrying she had started to think about the house, about what it was worth, about what it could solve. I said, you could have told me. She said, I know. I said, you could have told Mom. She looked at the window. I could not, she said. You do not understand what it was like to call Mom and hear her voice and know she was going to ask about David and have to pretend. Every time. For 18 months. I said she would not have judged you. Dana said, I know that now. But at the time, I could not let her see that I had failed. I said, a marriage ending is not a failure. She said, I know that too. Now. She was quiet for a moment. The clock on the mantel was still, 11:42. Outside, a car passed slowly on Birchwood Lane. I waited. She said, I had $37,000 in savings when David left. She said it plainly, the way you say a number when the shame of it has burned down to something cooler. I spent 22 of it in the first year covering the mortgage alone. I have 15 left. The house payment is due in 11 days. She looked at me. I am not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I am telling you because you asked me to explain, and this is the explanation. I looked at this house and I saw a solution, and I did not stop to think about what I was doing to you. I only thought about what I needed. I said, you forged Mom's signature. She closed her eyes. I know. I said, you drove to the county recorder's office on the afternoon of her funeral. She said, yes. I said, you took the deed from my house. She opened her eyes. I am sorry, she said. Not about the deed specifically, about everything. About the shape of what I became. When I was scared and alone and out of options. I'm sorry about that. I looked at my sister. I looked at the woman who had stood at our mother's grave with a notarized deed transfer in her coat pocket and driven to the county recorder's office before it closed. I looked at her and I thought about what it costs a person to do something like that. Not the legal cost, the interior cost, the cost of standing at a grave and doing math. I thought about that cost and I did not feel nothing. I am not built for feeling nothing, but I did not feel what she perhaps expected me to feel either. I did not feel softened. I felt clear. I sat down on the couch. I said, sit down, Dana. She sat in the armchair across from me. The same armchair Mom had sat in every evening to read. The worn spot on the right armrest, where she had rested her hand for 31 years. Dana sat in it, and she looked young and tired and very far from the person who had organized campaigns against 21-year-old girls, and called cousins for statements, and hired aggressive attorneys. She looked like my sister. She looked like the girl who had stood in this same room at 12 years old and cried when our father packed his things and drove away. I had held her hand then. She had let me. I said, I am not going to drop the challenge. She said, I know. I said, the house belongs to me. Mum made that clear, and Gerald has the record, and there is nothing you can file that changes it. She said, I know that too. Marcus told me last week. She almost smiled, but it did not hold. He told me I should have known that before I started. I said he was right. She said yes. I said, what do you need right now? She looked at me like the question surprised her. I said it again. not the house, not the estate. Right now, today, what do you actually need? She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I heard the neighbor's lawnmower start up 2 houses down. Long enough that Franklin came in from the back porch and walked through the living room without acknowledging either of us and disappeared into the kitchen. Dana watched him go. She said, I need to not lose my house. I said, your house, meaning your own house. She said, yes. I said, how much are you behind on the mortgage? She said, 3 months. I said, what is 3 months? She told me. The number was not small. It was not impossible either. I sat with it. I thought about my mother. I thought about the will and the note Gerald had read aloud in his office. Claire has been the caretaker of this house and of my wishes. It belongs with her. Mum had known Dana would need something. She had known it, and she had still made her choice. That choice was not cruelty. Mum was not cruel. It was clarity. She had left the house to the person she trusted to do the right thing with it, which was not necessarily the same as doing the comfortable thing, or the easy thing, or the thing that kept everyone happy. I said, I am going to sell the house. Dana looked up. I said, not right away. I need to go through it properly. I need to tend the rose garden through the spring. I need to be sure Franklin has somewhere to go. But I am going to sell it eventually, and when I do, a portion of what it sells for will come to you. Not half. Not equal. But enough. Dana said, why? I said, because Mom left it to me, and part of leaving something to someone is trusting them to decide what to do with it. And because you are my sister, and you are in trouble, and Mom would not want me to pretend I do not see that. Dana pressed her hands flat on her knees. She looked at the bookshelf. She looked at the clock, stopped at 11:42. She said, I took the deed from your house. I said, I know. She said, I had the transfer notarized before the funeral. I said, I know. She said, I do not know how to explain that to you. I said, you already did. You were scared. She said, that is not an excuse. I said, no, it is not. But it is a reason, and reasons matter to me even when they do not excuse. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I told Marcus this morning to withdraw the motion. I said Gerald will need to hear that formally. She said it will be filed by end of day Monday. I nodded. I said, and you need to give back the deed. She said, I do not have it. I said, where is it? She said, I destroyed it. I said, when? She said, when Marcus told me we could not win. Last week. She looked at me steadily. I wanted you to know that. I said, it does not matter. The county has the original. She said, I know. I did it anyway.